Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb, book 1 of the Farseer trilogy. This is my third read of this book, and it's been reviewed many, many times on YouTube by lots of much more clever people than I. So what can I bring to the table? Well, let's see, shall we? I read this back in 1999 into 2000. I bought it in Wadebridge in Cornwall when I was visiting my wife's family for the first time before we were married. And I bought them in a little bookstore in Cornwall. All three of them in one fell swoop. They were recommended to me by the bookshop person. So I remember sitting by the River Cam in Wadebridge, reading this book, and it's a feeling. I can remember that feeling of sitting there on a hot summer's day, reading a new fantasy book and experiencing the sights and the sounds and the smells. It was a glorious moment, and it was a moment that went on to become quite life-changing for me. How so? Well, the book itself is really well written, I would say. It's quite a slow-paced book, so I'm trying to be spoiler-free for the minute, but I'm going to get into spoilers most definitely, so I'll try and alert you when that's about to happen. I read these books, all three of them, when I was working in Kazakhstan. I'd just moved there to start a new job as a Russian translator. And it was when I got to the end of the books that I came up with my philosophy, for want of a better word, my outlook, my worldview of art and God and creation. And it came through the lens of alcoholism and addiction. So that's something different that I'm bringing to the review of this book that you might not have heard from other YouTube reviewers. It's to do with the magic system in these books. So I think I can go ahead and say what they are without spoiling too much. There are two magic systems. One is called the skill and the other is called the wit. One of them's to do with communication with animals. That's the wit. And the other one is to do with communication between people. The skill. I see them as being kind of related, but in the book here it's explained that they're kind of opposite, or at least one of the main characters believes that they are opposites. I'm going to read a section of the book now from just past the middle, page 265. Now it's not particularly spoilery in terms of how the plot goes, but you may want to look away because I'm going to explain how the author describes what the skill is all about. And at the top, I've written some notes where I've said, is this like the big battle at the end of Oathbringer? So, Brandon Sanderson book. And is this where one can lose oneself? This may be what gave rise to my philosophy of madness. So I'll talk about that in a bit. But here we go. Here's a section from chapter 15, The Witness Stones. The skill, at its simplest, is the bridging of thought from person to person. It can be used a number of ways. During battle, for instance, the commander can relay simple information and commands directly to those officers under him if those officers have been trained to receive it. One powerfully skilled can use his talent to influence even untrained minds or the minds of his enemies, inspiring them with fear or confusion or doubt. Though it's a bit like the Force in that regard, which is an interesting note here because the Force is also referred to in Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, as a hocus-pocus religion by Han Solo. So that idea of it being a religion is connected to the idea of a higher power or God or the universe or something above us. And that's what I get from the skill as well. Men so talented are rare, But if incredibly gifted with the skill, a man can aspire to speak directly to the Elderlings, those who are below only the gods themselves. Few have ever dared to do so, and of those who did, even fewer attained what they asked. For it is said, one may ask of the Elderlings, but the answer they give may not be to the question you ask, but to the one you should have asked. And the answer to that question may be one a man cannot hear and live. For when one speaks to the Elderlings, then is the sweetness of using the skill strongest and most perilous. And this is the thing that every practitioner of the skill, weak or strong, must always guard against. For in using the skill, the user feels a keenness of life, an uplifting of being that can distract a man from taking his next breath. Compelling is this feeling, even in the common uses of the skill, and addictive to any not hardened of purpose. But the intensity of this exaltation when speaking to the Elderlings is a thing for which we have no comparison. Both senses and sense may be blasted forever from a man who uses the skill to speak to an Elderling. Such a man dies raving, but it is also true he dies raving of his joy. So, in terms of insanity, when one touches the Creator, one can lose one's mind. But raving of one's joy is something to ponder. That really hits home. For me, anyway. So, it's addictive. It's compelling. It's devouring. And the idea that came to me before I got into the God concept or the higher power idea was really inspired by thinking of madness, which took me back to a time when I was struggling a bit mentally, and the idea of madness came to me in a flash as freedom. Freedom from societal restrictions, from laws. It's a bit Nietzschean, I suppose, in that sense. Like crime and punishment and the Übermensch concept, the Napoleon complex. You know, those ideas where one thinks that one is beyond societal constraints and laws, that one is too good for them and therefore is no longer bound by them. But that's for the rational. For the irrational, when one becomes mad or insane, then one is no longer accountable for one's actions, and one can go about life in a sense free. So that's not a very healthy frame of mind to be in, and well, I wasn't at the time when I came up with this idea. Was that before I read these books? Yes, it was. This is when I was in Odessa, so interestingly enough, all of this thinking tends to happen when I'm in the former Soviet Union. What does that tell you? I don't know. So that idea came to me then in Odessa, 1995-ish. Fast forward to 99, 2000, I'm reading The Assassin's Apprentice and the trilogy, and I'm starting to come up with ideas of art and of connection to source, to higher power. This is before I got into Alcoholics Anonymous, so I wouldn't have been calling it a higher power then. That's specifically a term that I picked up from Alcoholics Anonymous. But the idea of human connection, of harmony. At that point, I hadn't had my first spiritual awakening either. That came later. But let's just say it came down to the concept of art, because when I was reading these ideas from an author who's a human who has ideas of her own, and I was interpreting them based on my own life experiences, my own filters, my own education, etc., I was interpreting someone else's creative work, someone else's art. And I believe that in order to create art, one must connect to something higher. That's the purpose of art. And it's to express that connection through one's own filters, experiences, education, circumstances, everything that goes together to make a person is then expressed through connecting to a higher power. I keep pointing up because I believe that, it's up there somewhere. But it's impossible for a person to take on board someone else's thoughts and expression and art. It's impossible to take that on and receive it exactly as it was intended, because we're all unique. So there's no way for that to be passed over with, what would you call it, high fidelity, and then unpacked again and received exactly as it was created. What happens is what has been created is then received and opened up and unpacked and interpreted. So it becomes something else. And I think that's a beautiful thing. It's human connection. Now from there, I got into the idea that we each of us have life source. Whence that comes, we don't know, but my belief is that it's part of the whole. It's part of the universe. It's part of God. It's part of the harmony, whatever you want to call it. Our life source comes from that and is imprisoned, perhaps one might say, inside one's soul. Or perhaps the soul and the life force are inextricably linked. Perhaps they're one and the same. This is Future Cams. I'm just doing my edit and I wanted to cross the streams and read out a bit that is in Brandon Sanderson's Rhythm of War. So if you haven't read that, you might want to tune out, but it's not really giving away any spoilers. So it says, "See? No sense?" Zahel shrugged. "Cut off a bit of divinity and leave it alone. Eventually it comes alive. And if you let a man die with too invested a soul, or invest him right as he's dying, he'll leave behind a shadow you can nail back onto a body. His own, if you're feeling charitable." So we have a bit of divinity. And I think that sums up this idea of life force that I'm talking about. So we're getting similar concepts coming up in two different fantasy series by different authors, and I find that fascinating. Right, back to the feature film. But that little piece of life force is animated into a biological organism, and it lives. It goes about biologically interacting with the world, physically interacting with the world. So then we've got biology and we've got physics, and chemically as well, chemistry as well. So science is there, but so is the spirit. So that gets into the science versus religion idea, but I don't like the concept of religion as such here. I prefer to call it spirituality. I don't think that God is owned by a particular religion. That's another thing for another time, if ever. Probably not. So we've got the spirit inside the scientific, and it's about doing its thing, living its life, and interacting with other humans who also have an animating life force inside them, or as part of them. And that is what brings about the human connection. That's what can cause one to resonate in the company of certain people, or to, when one puts down one's walls, which is what one has to do in order to use the skill, then one can connect much more freely with other humans. And that's what happens inside the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, by the way. I've attended those meetings over the years, and I have had some meetings where the spirit in the room was palpable. Because you're in a room of vulnerable people who feel that they're in a safe space, dropping their walls and sharing from the heart difficult things. And in so doing, there's a connection that forms between us in the room, and that becomes manifest. Something starts to resonate in the room, and that is what I get from the skill. And the idea of dropping one's walls is a difficult thing, particularly where there's trauma or where fear is involved. And fear-based living, I believe, is what led me to pick up alcohol and drugs in the first place. And what now causes me to seek solace in sugar or doom scrolling or shopping. There's all kinds of ways that one can soothe one's soul in a negative way. The positive way is with something like the skill, connection, human connection. So I don't know if I've explained this very well, and it might not inspire you to read the book, but it just might, you know. And one of the other things that happens in this book is that the baddies who come along, the Out Islanders, the Red Ship Raiders, they go along the coast of the Six Duchies and they take people away to be forged. And that word comes from the name of the town where this first happened, which was Forge. And I'm going to read you a section about what this means. It's basically when one's life force is taken away, but the animation of the body remains. So you become like a zombie, in essence. And it says here on page 188, Chade wondered out loud, misery in his voice. What's wrong with them? What's got into them? I knew. All the threads that run back and forth between folk, that twine from mother to child, from man to woman, all the kinships they extend to family and neighbour, to pets and stock, even to the fish of the sea and birds of the sky. All were gone. All my life, without knowing it, I had depended on those threads of feelings to let me know when other live things were about. Dogs, horses, even chickens had them, as well as humans. And so I would look up at the door before Burrich entered it, or know there was one more newborn puppy in the stall, nearly buried under the straw. So I would wake when Chade opened the staircase, because I could feel people. And that sense was the one that always alerted me first, that let me know to use my eyes and ears and nose as well, to see what they were about. But these folk gave off no feelings at all. So that connecting life force is gone, it's been removed. And they're left animated, acting in the world, following base desires, eating, sleeping, drinking. That's it. And they are the ones who will fight for food. They won't feel any empathy towards any other people, even their own kin. All they care about is survival of the biological, the physical, and no connection at all. So what a horrific, horrific thing to happen. Imagine that. Imagine that. And something that just came to mind as I'm editing the video and thinking on this is the section where it says that the user feels a keenness of life and uplifting of being that can distract a man from taking his next breath. And the idea, I think, is that we're afraid of death, and that's why we have a connection to this Mother Earth, to our bodies, that we want to stay here and not give in to the light. Don't go into the light. You know, that kind of thing. But ultimately, that's what the soul, I think, is yearning for. Because that's the ultimate connection. It's when you become part of it without being restricted by a body. So that's really what I have to say about Assassin's Apprentice. It's not probably the kind of review that you're used to seeing on BookTube. And perhaps as I get into the next books in the series, I'll be able to come back and develop this idea. But honestly, I don't think it develops all that much more than what I've already talked about. It just builds inside the books to a crescendo where the connection and the usage of the magic systems becomes absolutely beautiful. It's expressed in such a beautiful way, so that might be something I come back and do a review of the full trilogy when I get to the end of it. So if that's something that you think would be interesting, stick around. I'll leave it there for this one. I'm just going to get this out there because if I wait and try and make it perfect, I just won't get it done. So it is what it is, to use the parlance of our times. What's in the review is in the review. Thanks for watching. See you again in the next one. Bye for now.